Okay, now we'll start with a new sthana, nidana sthana. अथा तो वातव्याधिनिदानं व्याख्यास्यामः यथोवाच भगवान् धन्वन्तरिः. Now, the धन्वन्तरिं धर्मपदां वरिष्ठम् अमृतोद्भवं चरणम् उपसंगृह्य सुश्रुत परिपृच्छति वायोः प्रकृतिभूतस्य व्यापन्नस्य च कोपनैः स्थानं कर्म च रोगांश्च वद मे वरदाम्बर. Now this sthana starts with the request by the student to the teacher, like we need to know about the vata. तस्य तद्वचनं श्रुत्वा प्राब्रवीत् भिषजाम्बरः स्वयं भूः एष भगवान् वायुः इत्यभिशब्दितः. स्वातन्त्र्यात् नित्यभावाच्च सर्वतत्त्वात् तथैव च सर्वेषामेव सर्वात्मा सर्वलोकनमस्कृतः स्थिति उत्पत्तिविनाशेषु भूतानां एष कारणम् अव्यक्तो व्यक्तकर्मा च रूक्षः शीतः लघुः खरः तिर्यगो द्विगुणश्चैव रजो बहुल एव च अचिन्त्यवीर्यः दोषाणां नेतो रोगसमूहराट् आशुकारी मुहुश्चारी पक्वाधान बुधालयः. Now, in the study of the diseases as well as the physiology, the Vayu comes the first. Vayu is compared to the Vayu which is present in the universe also, Vayu Mahabhuta, and the same Vata Dosha. Vata Dosha in the body would be considered as the Swatantra. Now, word Swatantra is also having two different meanings. Often translated as autonomy or independence, but actual meaning of swatantriya is swakarma vishaye nanyena priyate ityartha. An individual or a component which is self-sufficient, which is able to do its function, decide and then execute the functions of his own or whatever that entities. Self-dependent is the swatantriya. It's not really autonomy or independence. Swatantriya being translated as independence or autonomy is not the correct translation. It's the real translation would be it's a self-dependency. Now, autonomous again means self-directed. It's not self-directed. It's actually meaning self-controlled or self-dependent as such. So it's not totally absolute independence. Absolute independence is not physiology. Physiology is always dependent as such. Physiological this explanation of the swatantra could be in terms of the genetic expression. See, at the time of the birth of cell itself, the genes would be deciding the characters, and these genes would be deciding the function for that. So the gene expression would be controlling the traits of the cell and the cell function too. So throughout the series of synthesis of DNA, RNA, and protein. So the level of vata functioning would be at that level too, where the whole function, life of the cell is regulated, and hence the interpretation of vata at the level of a cell is possible in terms of that sequential expression of the genes. I am not saying that genes are vata, but the functions of the gene, where there will be a sequential expression of the trait and the cell function, that can be considered as vata. Then नित्यभावात् नित्यस्य कारणरहितत्वेन स्वतन्त्रत्वं ततश्च स्वयंभूत्वम् इत्यर्थः. That's nityaka is which is constant, which is present in throughout the life, since birth to the death of the cell. Now, the same, the genes and the genetic expression is the mechanism which keeps the cell responding to the stimuli around and become making it relevant, or what we call as living. I'm not saying that genetic expression is the life. The life is something beyond that. But the living functions, the science of the life are seen, and that's what we mean by the Nityagatva. And now the comparison to that Nityagatva is the Akashavata, like the space which you see, this is in the Mahabhuta, Akash Mahabhuta. And Chakaratvat Sukshmatvam Api Paramano Hiva Swayam Bhutve Samukriyate. So because it's a very fine thing, minute thing, which cannot be seen. Of course, DNA and the nucleic acids, they are not visible to the naked eye. Now, of course, we can make out indirectly with the electron microscopes. So, because of its Sukshmatva, they are considered as Swayambhu. Then, Sthiti Utpatti Vinasheshu Bhutanam Yesha Karanam. The physiological explanation of that is once that cell has become alive or once a cell is born, the whole function of the cell would be to achieve the specific target function of that particular cell. Like suppose if it is about this cell of a gland, the cell of the gland is supposed to secrete the specific secretions. Now, what are those secretions to be secreted by that cell would be decided by the genetic functions, genetic expression. Genes would decide like what are the secretions to be done. But at the same time, when the cell lives in its environment, the surroundings, the modification of the functions would be according to the stimulus of the environment. Either it can go on functioning smoothly, or if there are some stressful factors in the surrounding area, in the environment, the cells may adjust to that, and that's what you call as a adaptation. See, based upon the factors around surrounding area, the cells have a capacity, the tissue, whatever that, they have a capacity to cope up with the need of the surroundings, and this is what you call as adaptation. The adaptation could be either what we see as the normal, where the tissue will be growing at a normal level, and some what we call as the average. That's when I say normal, that's the average. Take the example of a muscle. A muscle sheet, muscle bundle would have a normal size, what we generally consider as the normal. Suppose there is some factor which prevents the muscles to function properly, it may result in atrophy. The cell size may reduce, or if there is a continuous stress like a gym, going to a gym, the cells may become bigger, hypertrophy can occur, or if there is a need, the number of cells can increase to achieve the function of the muscle, or in these are what we call as the normal adaptations which result in the normal functions. Suppose if there is a reduced blood supply and then the muscle cells cannot survive, the muscle cells may be replaced by fibrous tissue, or it may become displaced totally. The growth may change and it may result in a tumor conditions. These are all due to the external stimuli. So the sthiti utpatti vinasheshu bhutanamesha karanam, the external stimuli which can modify the life of the cell is one of the things which can be considered as vata. Or the cells would have a limited life. At the end of some achieving certain target, every cell would have to die, and the death of the cell is present at the time of the birth itself. This is what the vacuoles are there, and the vacuoles will have the cytolysing enzymes which can destroy the cell at the end of the functions. So once it has achieved the function, the cells would die, and that's what called as apoptosis. Apoptosis is a phenomena where the cells have a limited life, and once the cell has achieved its target function, it has to go. This is the normal physiology. Jatasya maranam dhvam. Every being, once it is born, it has to die, and that death is predetermined at the time of the birth itself. And that's exactly what you contain in the cells. The cells, every cell has the enzymes of the death, the cytolysins present in the cell, and once that function is achieved, these will come into the picture. The cell will shrink in size, and gradually it will be dead, and then that debris of the cell would be eaten by the macrophages, and hence the space is clear for the new generation to come in. And this is the sthiti utpatti vinasha, when the vata functions are described. Now these kinds of the balancing mechanism, this is a very complex mechanism where the every aspect of the cell function is regulated, and that is also the sign of vata. Then achintya virya doshanam neta, the body has many several organs and several systems. None of the system would be functioning independently. There is always an interdependence as such. There is a very common story like suppose there is a story in Panchatantra, like one day there was a debate between the stomach, hand, and the legs and head. The stomach was saying that, pleading that because of me, all the other organs are being nourished, so you are dependent on me, I am superior. Then the hands would say, like, because I work hard, you get the food, and I am superior. The legs would say, like, because I am able to move, you get the food, and then I am superior. And then one day they went on strike. Every organ, each of the organ went on strike, and at the end it becomes a chaos. But in reality, every organ is dependent on the other. The stomach needs to be there, and it can provide the nourishment to the hand so that hand can do its function. Hand will be carrying the food to the stomach, or it works hard and it fills the stomach, so on. So there is a dependence between the systems. Now, what I have told as a story is a very simple, common story. In terms of the physiology, of course, every organ is dependent on the other. A respiratory system is dependent on the muscular system to breathe in, to have the effort. The oxygen provided by the respiratory system makes the muscles contract, so on and so forth. So every system is dependent on each other. If one system is affected, then the other system also would be affected. If there is an impairment of the lungs, then the oxygenation of the other tissues would be affected, the heart would be affected, kidney would be affected, and so on. So, if the heart is not able to function, the lungs would be congested and the lungs would be losing the function. Now, this kind of interrelationship is very complex, and that's why Sushruta has used the word achintya and doshanam neta. The carrying of one defect or one pathology to the other, or impact of changes in one system to the other, is the doshanam neta. So that's the exchange of services between several organ systems, and it's a very complex issue and elaborate issue. Whole of the physiology is dependent on this factor, and to have a complete coverage of that would not be possible. Whatever I have quoted is just as an example to make you understand what we mean by, or what we can interpret in terms of the current physiology about ajintavirya doshana. Then देहे विचरतस्तस्य लक्षणानि निबोध मे दोषधात्वज्ञ समतां संप्राप्तिं विषयेषु च क्रियाणाम् अनुलोम्यं च करोति अकुपितो अनलः इंद्रियार्थ उपसंप्राप्तिं दोषधात्वज्ञ अवैकृतं क्रियाणाम् अनुलोम्यं च कुर्यात् वायुः अदूषितः. Now there are specific words. One doshadhatmagni samata, and then kriyanam anulomyam. These are the two important words. That doshadhatmagni samata is a maintenance of the balance between the various systems. And at the end, even if there is a slight imbalance, which is normally present, normally there is a tendency for the imbalance, and that normal this possibility of imbalance are not resulting in seeing that the changes over the body. In a normal situation, you have a capacity to tolerate those minute imbalances together, and this mechanism is called as homeostasis, or it's a buffering mechanism. Like, to give an example, now there are innumerable number of homeostatic mechanisms in the body. I'm just giving you one example. Suppose due to some reasons body temperature falls, then the blood vessels constrict so that the heat is conserved, and then the heat is retained and the body temperature is maintained normal. Like in cold weather, when the atmosphere is cold, your body temperature may not change because of this complex mechanism. When you are exposed to the cold, there will be a mechanism by which the blood vessels, peripheral skin blood vessels will constrict, and hence the heat loss will be reduced and the body temperature is maintained. Same way, if the temperature is increased in the environment, the sweat glands will open up, there will be more of sweat, perspiration, heat loss, and hence the body temperature is maintained. So that's what we call as a homeostatic mechanism. That's exactly what we mean by dosha dhatwagni samata, which is again a very complex mechanism. Or it could be like a maintenance of the normal physiological limits. An example, I'm just giving you only a few examples. There are, you can give innumerable numbers of examples. Every function is having a similar mechanism, like the blood sugar level. Once you have consumed the food would be, the glucose would be reaching, it will be converted into glycogen by the insulin, and the free glucose which is present in the blood would be deciding. Now there is always a negative feedback mechanism. If the blood sugar level increases beyond a set limit, the amount of insulin secreted will be more, so that the extra glucose will be converted. Suppose if there is a blood glucose level is reduced, then the glycogen will be converted back into the glucose and the blood sugar level will be maintained. So this is what we call as a negative feedback mechanism. These also are what we mean by the vata functions. So vata is not simply nervous system. Vata is a very complex issue which regulates every aspect of the physiology of the body. यथा अग्निः पञ्चधा भिन्नः नाम स्थानक्रियामयैः भिन्नो अनिलः तथा हि एको नाम स्थानक्रियामयैः. The to make you understand these complex mechanisms and try to make it simplified, Ayurveda has classified these functions into five categories and they are the panchavatas. Now that five vata varieties, they are not really the five vata varieties. They are not five types of vata. Is about description of the functions of the vata in terms to make you understand and have that clear understanding of the different systems as such. And based upon that, they are prana, udano, samanashta, vyanashta, apana evata, sanastaha, mardaha, pancha, yapayanti shariran. Though the word meaning is five vatas, I don't say that they are the five vatas. It's about the different five functions, the functional aspects of the vata. Vata is single, there are no five vatas. It's about single vata, which would have different functions. And to make you understand that simple, to simplify that complex mechanisms of the different homeostatic mechanisms and adaptation mechanisms, it's classified into the functions are classified into the five categories, and among them the first is pranavata, and the pranavata the functions are यो वायु वक्र संचारी स प्राणो नाम देहधृक सो अन्नम प्रवेशयति अंत प्राणांश्च आपि अवलंबते प्रायश कुरुते रुष्टो हिक्का श्वासादिकान् ददान. The mechanisms of the body which help in the swallowing of the food and maintenance of the respiration. Now, is from the current physiology point of view, the same can be described in terms of the swallowing control pathways, where once you have that stimulus in the oral cavity, the presence of the food in the body, the signal would be reaching to the nucleus through the vagal afferent nerve and the nucleus ambiguous, and that's in the base of the brain, at the brain stem, you have that. And through that, the signals will be reaching to the muscles, then through the nerves into the muscles. And the very simple would be as you swallow, the trachea should be closed and the esophagus should open up. The sphincters of the esophagus would open up and the trachea would be closed by the epiglottis. Otherwise, the food will get into the respiratory tract. Now, maintenance of this that, and otherwise, when you breathe in, the trachea will be open, esophagus, the air doesn't enter into the esophagus so freely. Now, this kind of a complex mechanism of selective constriction and relaxation of the muscle is the vata, pranavata. I am not saying that now it should not be misunderstood as the nerves. Pranavata are not the nerves. Pranavata is not the nucleus ambiguous. Pranavata is the whole system mechanism of maintenance of these regulations where you will have a coordination of the different functions and that results in a smooth functioning. And one example would be swallowing. There could be impairment of different sorts if the patient somehow the function central nucleus is not functioning properly. As the person swallows, the instead of swallowing the or the food reaching into the gastrointestinal tract, it may reach to the respiratory tract. If there is a pathology in the glottis, epiglottis area, or if the nerves, the motor nerves which reach to that area are affected, there could be what we call as a bulbar palsy. As you have in the patient in 236 now, the bulbar palsy where the nucleus, the bulb is being affected and hence the patient would have a difficulty in swallowing, a vata vikriti. Or it could be like if the nerves are damaged due to some reasons, as occurs in case of some trauma injuries, head injury patients. Now, patients who had a head injury, just like the patient who was in 201 hours and discharged 2 days back, young boy. Now, there, of course, he now has recovered, but he had a swallowing difficulty where you have to this kind of mechanism. Or it could be like a patient who is unconscious and hence is not able to swallow. As in any other cerebrovascular accident patients, the system conscious functions of the cerebral cortex are affected, and hence all this system is not able to function. There too you may have a swallowing difficulty, or the swallowing difficulty could be due to some local mechanism, local swelling, or some impact, this injury to the area, the pharynx, and hence the swallowing difficulty could occur. Now, these kind of different variable causes which can produce the pathology, they have to be understood by the mechanism of understanding the pranavata. Or the pranavata also is an example of the function of the pranavata is a regulation of the respiration. Simple, again to make it very simplified, when the skeletal muscles are contracted in the body, that this impulse from the skeletal muscles will reach to the respiratory center, which makes them more stimulated. The respiratory center will be stimulated to cope up with the requirement of the oxygen in the skeletal muscle, and this gives a impulse to the lungs to stretch more. The stretch receptors present in the lung would give a inhibitory signal, and they say that it cannot just go beyond that. Now, this kind of balance, like when there is a demand for oxygen by the skeletal muscle, the lungs would have better air exchange, and the better air exchange could be by making the lungs expand more, as well as it also increases the rate of respiration. The rate of respiration by the respiratory center also would be enhanced so that the oxygen exchange will be increased. But this doesn't go to a limit where the lungs would be damaged or lungs would be destroyed due to that increased demand due to the presence of the stretch receptors. Now, this kind of a mechanism where you have an accelerator as well as a brake system is the function of pranavata. Now, this has to be understood in that manner. Similarly, उदानः उदानो नाम यस्तु ऊर्ध्वमुपैति पवनोत्तमः तेन भाषित गीतादिविशेषः अभिप्रवर्तते ऊर्ध्वगतगतान् रोगान् करोति च विशेषतः. Regulation of the speech is the main function of the Udanavata. Now, regulation of the speech also is a very complex mechanism. See, one is the cortex has to be trained now to produce a speech. You need to be exposed to the speech, you need to have heard the words, and then that whatever the speech, there has to be, the brain has to be a condition to that area of the speech. At the same time, whenever there is a need to speak, there is an intellectual component. You need to know what is to be spoken. And this is based upon previous experiences, previous learning, and then the environment, and multiple factors will decide like what are the words you are going to frame, the language which you have studied, all that would be coming to role, which we as called as intellectual components or cortical functions as such. Then once that is done, depending upon the situation, the right form of the speech has to be produced. Whatever that word you need to think of that, that's the intellectual component of that word formation. Then the speech center has to stimulate the specific nerves, and the nerves have to regulate the movement of the muscles of the speech. The major muscles of the speech is one is the larynx, vocal cord, and then all the facial muscles. They allow or they make the air move in a specific quantity, and the resistance to the air is regulated by the buccal muscles, the oral cavity muscles, and this how you will have that mechanism of the speech form. This is again a complex mechanism, and all that would be having very complex regulation as such. The every aspect is regulated. The amount of the air coming through the vocal cord by widening or narrowing that opening in the vocal cord, as well as the tone of the muscles, how much of the muscles have to be stressed, the tongue, the teeth, every organ has a role, and hence you have the words like kantya, dantya, and so on, or palavya. That's what Panini has described. Now, all these issues would be the function of the Udanavata, or this, or what we see as the Udanavata. This kind of a complex mechanism of the coordination of functions is the Udanavata. Then आमपक्वाशयकरः समानः वह्निसङ्गतः सो अन्नं पचति तद्यांश विशेषान् विनित्य च गुल्म अग्निसार अतिसार प्रभृतीन् कुरुते ददान्. Now, the mechanism of regulating the digestion of the food, consumption and the digestion of the food is again a mechanism. Now, to have giving a simple example, the hunger center, once you feel the appetite, feel hungry, the center hunger center would be activated. That makes the muscles of the stomach move rapidly, which gives you a sensation of the hunger. And then you consume the food, and that food consumed would be digested. And the once you have consumed the food, how much of the acid has to be secreted and for how long the food has to be in the stomach is again a complex mechanism where the pH of the food would be deciding factor, like how much of the acid has to be secreted, and the contents of the stomach have to reach to a optimum pH. Then only they will be allowed to move into the duodenum and intestines further for the absorption function, as well as the consistency. If you have consumed a solid substance, till it becomes a sort of viscosity or the thickness of the chyle is decided. It may remain in the stomach, and the what we call as the gastric emptying period. The gastric emptying period is a dependent upon the two factors, simple, the physical and the chemical factors. The physical factors are how much the consistency of the food. Ultimately, it has to come to a semi-solid level or a optimum consistency where it can move through the gastrointestinal tract in, and then the chemical content, the pH has to be regulated. Then only the food would be moving into the duodenum and the jejunum, and then the absorption of the food would be by this again specified functions or specified areas of the intestines. Each of the cells would have a specific function of the digesting the components. The enzymes would be released, and the fat or the protein or the carbohydrate would be digested and absorbed. And this function, kind of regulation of these, would be the function of what we call as the Udarna Vata function or Samana Vata function, Samana Vata functions as such. It could be affected, like suppose your hunger center is not functioning properly, like the day of stress or maybe on the day of examination, you may not feel like eating at all. The appetite may be reduced. Then it could be due to the impairment of the functions of the stomach, that you have that different sets of the gastritis like conditions, gastric tumors and so on, where the digestion and these functions could be affected. The absorption in the intestines could be affected due to the lesions over there, and hence you may have the different varieties like Gulma, Agnisara, Atisara, Prabhutin. So Samanavata Vikriti can produce different abnormalities related to the consumption of the food and the digestion, and you need to assess which component of that is affected as such. Then कृष्णदेहतरः व्यानः रससंवहनोद्यतः स्वेद अस्विक्श्रावणश्चापि पञ्चधा चेष्टयत्यपि क्रुद्धश्च कुरुते रोगान् प्रायशः सर्वदेहगान्. The Vyanavata is related to the movement of the rasa, the blood, as well as the regulation of the blood to the different organs. Again, this is a very complex mechanism. To be give you a simple explanation, sympathetic and parasympathetic tones of the body would be regulating these as such. One of the simple example could be when you stand erect, the gravitational force will make the blood flow to the lower limb, the foot, but practically there will not be a pooling of the blood in the foot. Even the blood would be flowing to the brain equally when you are standing erect. Now, this mechanism is done by the selective contraction of the blood vessels of the foot and selective dilatation of the foot, blood vessels to the brain, so that the pressure in the circulation is maintained. And this mechanism is done by the sympathetic mechanism. Depending upon the physiological need, a, the blood flow to a specific organ could be increased or reduced. Like when you eat more, the blood flow to the stomach has to increase, and this is done at the cost of the blood flow to the other organs of the body. And that's why when the stomach is full and you attend the classes, you'll feel like sleepy, because the blood, you need more blood to the stomach and lesser, naturally that results in lesser blood to flow to the brain. And this is again the regulation of the what we call as a rasa samvahana. Rasa samvahana is not simply movement of the blood, pushing of the blood. It's about the regulation of the blood flow depending upon the physiological need. And again, this explanation can go on infinitely. Every organ of the body, every function of the body is depending upon these variables. And in summary, in brief, I will attribute this function to the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems of the body, autonomic systems of the body. But this explanation is not a complete explanation, it's in gross. And at the same time, the physiological activity like movement and or other physical activity also are dependent upon the same issue. It's not only the physical activity, even it's related to the emotional aspects. When you have a very strong emotions, there will be blushing of the face. The blood flow to the face will be enhanced. When you have to do more work, rigorous work, their heart has to pump more. You'll have the palpitation, the rate of the heart contraction will increase. Blood flow to a specific group of the muscle during some specific exercise, like when you have to run, blood flow to the muscles of the leg has to increase. When you do carry some weight in the hands, blood flow to the muscles of the hand has to increase. Now this kind of regulation, which helps in the motility, which helps in achieving a specific target function, is the Vyanavata. पक्वदानालयो अपानः कालयत् कर्षति चाप्यदः समीरणः सकृत् मूत्रं शुक्रगर्भात्तवानिजा क्रुद्धश्च कुरुते रोगान् घोरान् वस्तिकुलाश्रयान्. Now, the functions, regulatory functions about the excretion of the pelvic contents, pelvic excretory organs. The major pelvic excretory organs are the bladder and the rectum. The expulsion of the fecuses and expression of the urine is also a complex mechanism where, again, the systemic nerves as well as the sympathetic and parasympathetic process would have a control. Expulsion of the feces and the urine have again two layers of functions. See, initially at the time of the birth, these functions are totally involuntary. Gradually, there is a learning, and based upon the learning aspects, they become somewhat voluntary. See, micturition and the defecation, they are not totally involuntary, nor totally voluntary in an adult. In a young child, it's a newborn, it's totally involuntary. Now, a involuntary functioning becoming a voluntary function is again a complex mechanism where there is a role of the whole of the system, the central nervous system, and the complex mechanism of learning. And often it is said that the most difficult thing to learn is in the life is the regulation of or controlling of this involuntary function into the voluntary function. And those who have learned this act, control of micturition and the defecation, every other subject is easy. Learning Ayurveda is very easy if we have learned how to control the micturition and defecation. So now these kinds of the regulation is Apanavata. So Apanavata is not only the pudendal nerves, it's not only the function of the these nerves as such, it's about the whole complex mechanism of regulation of the evacuation, which is dependent upon multiple factors, factors related to the organ like the bladder, tone, bladder, the muscles, sensory functions of the bladder, or as well as it's also related to the urinary system, how much of the urine is produced and how much of the urine is rate of the urine production. And it's also related to the higher centers like identifying a location, proper location for the micturition and having control over the muscles, and role of the voluntary muscles like the abdominal muscles help in the evacuation of the urine. Now, all these complex mechanism of multiple layers that can be considered as a apanavata as such. So, apanavata is these complex mechanisms. So, important is the functions of all that vata, what we consider as the specific vata, can be explained in terms of the physiology. There is no difference between modern physiology and Ayurvedic physiology. The modern physiology is looking at the subject in a different manner where each of these functions are studied at a specific compartment. Like when it comes to the question of bladder control, you have the mechanism of urodynamics, one aspect, then the neuronal control, then the voluntary components. So they are studied separately. The three sections are studied separately. Whereas from Ayurvedic point of view, These three, all these are studied in or presented in a single word, like a specific matter like Apanavata or the Vanavata and so on. And hence it looks like the subject is different, but it's not different. The only thing is we have to review or relook at the object subject based upon whatever you have studied the other way. So it's not that the modern physiology is different and Ayurvedic physiology are different. The only thing is the way you look at it and the way you analyze, they are different. So, subject is not different, the method of analysis are different, and once you see that the difference in analysis and try to cope up in a this comprehensive manner, there is virtually no difference as such. Shukradosha pramehastu vyana apana prakopajaha yugabat kupitastapi deham bhinjuhu asamshayam. Of course, because of the abnormalities of the Vyanamata and Apanamata, you will have multiple complications. अधश्च अत ऊर्ध्वं प्रवक्ष्यामि नानास्थानान्तराश्रितः बहुशः कुपितो वायुः विकारान् कुरुते हि यन् वायुः आमाशये क्रुद्धः छर्द्यादीन् कुरुते गदान् मोहं मूर्छां पिपासं च हृद्ग्रवहं पार्श्ववेदनां पक्वाशयस्थो अन्तर्कूजं शूलं नाभौ करोति च कृच्छ्रमूत्रपुरीषत्वम् आनाहं त्रिकवेदनां श्रोत्रादिषु इन्द्रियवधं कुर्यात् क्रुद्धः समीरणः. Now, this is about the how to analyze a clinical strain or a clinical disease. A symptom, like any symptom, could occur due to multiple causes. Like, give an example of vomiting, chandi, nausea. Now, nausea, vomiting could be produced due to multiple causes, and you may have categories. Suppose a patient comes to the nausea and vomiting, the protocol of dealing with the whole how to deal with would be you have to decide whether it is a gastrointestinal tract function abnormality or non-gastrointestinal tract abnormalities. Now, gastrointestinal functions abnormality could be there could be an obstruction somewhere, and hence the patient may have vomiting. It could be a functional where the movement of the substances in the stomach could be affected, or it could be due to the abnormalities of the stomach environment, the inflammatory pathologies like gastritis, like an obstruction like a tumor, pyloric stenosis, etc. Functional like the dysmotility or echinacea, etc. Inflammatory like gastritis. A vomiting also can occur due to the non-gastrointestinal tract conditions like a central nervous system, as in case of encephalitis, meningitis, irritation of the brain, it can result in. Toxic conditions can result in acidosis, uremia, and that can result in vomiting, or simply stress, like a patient who has a severe infection, severe pain in their body, can also produce reflex vomiting. Now, when Sushruta says like the Nana Sthanantarashitaha and the different vikara are produced when depending upon the location of the Vayu at a different sthana. Vayu Amashe Krubdha Chhadyadin Kurute Gada. When it is located in the stomach, it may produce Chhadyadi, or the vata in the samana, this prana level also can produce the same symptoms, and this has to be understood. Now that again makes the same issue. Approach to a patient presenting with a symptom is not simply like you make the diagnosis as a chardi. Instead, you have to go back to that level where which of the component of the vata is affected, and then you need to manage that. Now, similarly, the clinical symptoms which could occur due to the different organs would be different, which we will continue in the next session. Today, we will wind up today because of some commitments. I have to stop early. If there are any questions, I'll try to answer the questions and then wind up. Right, there are no questions. So, we'll continue in the next session about this. Okay, thank you. So,
Thank you, sir.